The BBC understands that British-made Storm Shadow cruise missiles have been used on at least one target inside Russia for the first time. Reports indicate they hit a target in the southwestern region of Kursk. Russian military bloggers have posted photos of what they say are fragments of Storm Shadow missiles from a village near that area. Powerful explosions can be heard on unverified video purportedly shot there as well. Well, all of that follows a day after Ukraine fired US-made ballistic missiles known as Atacms in the neighbouring Russian region of Bryansk. Moscow has promised it will respond to any strike on Russian territory that uses long-range Western weapons. Washington is also providing Ukraine with anti-personnel landmines to try to slow the advance of Russian troops. Well, the UK's Defence Secretary, John Healey, he has been speaking in the House of Commons today. He wouldn't directly confirm those reports I was talking about UK missiles when he was speaking there a little earlier, and said Ukraine's action on the battlefield speaks for itself.
My understanding is also that Storm Shadow has been fired for the first time into Russia. It's very important to bear in mind it has been used inside Ukraine. It's been used against Russian targets, I think, in Crimea, but also in other parts of occupied Ukraine. But this is a threshold that has been crossed. It's a big step. And it's a big step because the Americans were reluctant to authorize this, because as far as I understand, there in some degree of American data sharing and intelligence was important in the employment of these weapons for maximum effectiveness. What is surprising is the sheer number of Storm Shadow that is reported to have been fired. I think it's about 10 or 12, according to the videos, according to some of the Russian accounts. That's going to be, I think, a very significant proportion of the sheer overall stockpile Ukraine has to begin with, because they really haven't got many.
A real quick answer exactly on that. What is your understanding about the numbers of Storm Shadow, the French missiles as well, and Atacms?
The answer is it's small. I don't know the exact number. If I had the exact number, I might be hesitant about publishing it for obvious reasons. But I can say it is small. So Ukraine has to pick every target with extreme care.
Now, of course, the fear is that Ukraine's defence on their eastern flank is getting close to collapse. What is your assessment of the Russian gains in those areas and any sort of likelihood of a major breakthrough by them?
Well, the central front is the most significant problem, the bit in the middle in Donetsk province, and Russia has been gaining ground. If nothing else changes, if Ukraine particularly doesn't fix its problems with manpower on this part of the front, a collapse is entirely possible by the spring. I wouldn't say by Christmas, by the spring. Now, that doesn't mean Russia can simply rush through to Dnipro, Odessa, other big Ukrainian cities. The Russian army is also tired, it's also weakened. But what Ukrainians worry about, what they tell me in the last few days, is that if the North Korean expeditionary force in Kursk, if this becomes a pipeline, a steady supply, in other words, we see tens and tens of thousands of North Koreans rather than 10,000 flat, that could become a serious problem for Ukraine.
Perhaps the landmines may take the place of personnel. Perhaps that's part of the equation of what we're seeing today. But of course, we're coming into the heavy winter now. How important is it that any gains that are made are done now in these next few weeks before really the winter sets in and there's little movement?
Well, that does matter because it is harder for armoured vehicles to operate on the ground in certain periods until the ground freezes properly. It is difficult for troops to be outside and conduct offensives. Having said all of that, Russia is fighting in very, very small assault detachments of a handful of troops in a single place. So the traditional constraints on armoured warfare over mushy ground in the winter months, a lot of that applies much less. The bit that does apply, that's quite interesting, is in a battlefield that is now saturated by drones, when you have a lack of foliage, a lack of tree cover, leaf cover, it makes it easier for drones to spot Russian forces on the move in open areas and for them to be attacked. So that will be a serious challenge for the Russians as the sort of landscape of Ukraine changes in the coming months.
a final thought, because what is your assessment of what happens in the early part of 2025? There are so many variables. What Ukraine is able to do in these next few months, what Moscow is able to do, and the change in dynamic of Donald Trump in the White House. What is your best guess at where that takes us in January, February, March?
Trump wants a deal. However, the question is, does he want a deal at any price? Or does he want leverage to force the Kremlin to the table to do a serious deal that would then have to be enforced? I think we don't know enough to say, but what I think he'll find is that things prove much more complicated than his initial demand to solve the war in a day. And he will actually have to grapple with some of these problems with his European allies, not just sloganeering.
Well, that was The Economist defence editor Shashank Joshi talking to me a little earlier. All the latest on the ground there, his assessment of what is happening in Ukraine and also the use of the UK Storm Shadow missiles.